We are talking about the life, ministry, and things of Paul for the Unfiltered Word R-rated Bible podcast. This evening I am with my good friend, Joe Crowe. Good evening, mate.
Good evening, mate. How you doing? You're right.
I'm good. So, Paul.
Paul the Apostle, Saint
Yeah.
Paul. Yeah. Fascinating character. Amazing life story of just he was completely and utterly changed from who he was, and he just became one of the most important figures in Christianity and probably one of the most important people in history. I don't think you're going too far to say that. I think this
Oh,
bloke became one of the most important people in human history. Yeah, so he's absolutely amazing guy. Yeah, yeah, and so
yeah.
it'd be cool to chat about his life, really. Yeah,
So we know Paul as one of Jesus's disciples, as
yeah.
probably one of his sort of inner circle, would you say?
Well,
His
in one
main man?
sense, yeah, in one sense, yes, but in another sense, so Paul, of course, isn't one of the 12. So he isn't one of the disciples who most people have heard of, the 12
Mm.
disciples, even if you can't list off all the names, but he wasn't one of them. So when Jesus
Right.
was actually walking on earth, Paul at that point was I don't know, it's hard to sort of say how old Paul would have been, but he was alive, but he was not one of those followers of Jesus. He wasn't a believer, you could say. He didn't believe who Jesus said he was, basically. Um, so Paul becomes a Christian a bit later on, basically. So after the death and after the resurrection, bring him back to life of Jesus, basically. So that's what makes him even more interesting sometimes, is that he's not been there since the start, if you know what I mean. Like he
Mm.
comes in just a little bit afterwards. Yeah. But yeah, so we know a bit about Paul, like his early life, but only what he says about himself. And there's a
Right.
little bit that some of the others said about him. So he was a Jewish man. Um, he was a very talented bloke at what he did. So in some of his letters, so Paul wrote loads of the New Testament part of the Bible. So many of the books in there are Paul's, or letters in there are Paul's, that he wrote to various churches. Um, and yeah, he says that he was like a teacher of teachers, and that he was far ahead of all his like peer group in his learning and in his progress in like the faith and in his like level of attainment and everything. So he was quite like he would have been seen as like the stellar chap, in his circles, that up and coming new guy who is leagues ahead of everybody else. So that's kind of where we first, well, that's what Paul tells us about himself before he was a Christian. Basically, that was who he was. Yeah, and he first comes on the scene in the Bible in the book of Acts. So Acts is like the proper name would be Acts of the Apostles. So it's like the book that describes after Jesus was raised again and went to heaven, what his immediate followers did basically for the next however many years. It just describes the birth of the church, I guess is probably the phrase you could use. And he crops up there um, about sort of, I don't know, less than a quarter of the way in. And it's in connection with a chap called Stephen. And I'm sure you know what happens to Stephen, Jack. I'm sure, of course. But Stephen was Stephen was stoned, believe it or not, as in killed with rocks, basically. Yeah, and that is where we first meet Paul. And he is not on the side of the crowd, if there was even two sides of the crowd. He is not there advocating for Stephen and trying to help this poor man out. Paul is Paul's on the other side of the crowd,
Right.
quite happy to watch this happening. So that's quite an introduction. Like it's only a few little sentences when you read it in here, but if you put yourself actually in the like time and place in your imagination, it's quite an entrance to meet a character and to know to see somebody for the first time. They're literally there watching as a man is killed, murdered.
Wasn't just watching though, was he?
He was not. No, no. So basically, Stephen's one of like very, very early Christians. So, he's known, he probably has known Jesus, during his ministry. I forget if he's not one of the 12 disciples, but Jesus obviously had a bigger group of followers other than the 12. And he's one of them. And basically Stephen does a big speech to all of the like people in and around the temple area, where he basically is just telling them Jesus is who he said he was. He's one of these early converts, and that's what he wants to do, is just go out and spread the message, basically. And yeah, he gives them a bit of a rebuke as well. So there's lots of the same people he's speaking to would have been there when Jesus was put on trial and all that. And Stephen gives them a bit of a rebuke. I think he literally says something like, "You're all a bunch of stiff-necked people. You're all hard of heart, and you basically put Christ to trial." So he really is, saying that to this kind of select group of individuals who were quite instrumental in it, and then he's just talking to the crowd in a wider sense. Yeah, and he basically gets them all riled up, because obviously they don't like hearing this kind of message, and they don't like hearing the preaching of Jesus, and so they kill him. Basically, he's like lynched, frankly. And yeah, as you said, Paul is not just like a passive bystander, I suppose, in that sense. I'm looking at it now. So it's here in Acts, and it says that as they were stoning Stephen, he called out. So Stephen calls out, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And falling to his knee, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lord, Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And when he had said this, he fell asleep. And it says about the people who were throwing the stones, they cast him, so they threw Stephen out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid down their garments, they took off their coats, basically, at the feet of a young man named Saul. So this is him. So we call him Paul. Yeah, we call him Paul, but it's kind of like, that's his kind of like Greekish name, like it's interchangeable with Saul, basically. Yeah. So, yeah. So he has got some kind of prominent role here, in that he's the bloke they go and leave all the stuff with. He's there, and it even says in a very understated way, "And Saul approved of his execution," which is kind of like it's quite an understatement, isn't it? But he's obviously quite an influential member of the crowd. He's the one who they lay all their clothing with, and he's right there approving of Stephen's death, basically. And that's our first intro to Paul. Yeah, if someone asks how to, obviously there's little phrases like that, and Saul approved of his execution. Like, well, how could the person writing this know what's going on inside Saul's head? I just want to check that off and just give that little bit of context. So Acts was wrote by a chap called Luke, and Luke again was another one of the very earliest Christian followers. He was also a very good friend of Paul. So after Paul was converted and became the Paul we all know now, Luke was one of his closest followers. So when Luke's writing this, I'm pretty confident that he had input from Paul himself, who could say, "Yeah, I was there. They laid their clothes at my feet, and I was happy what they did." Paul is ashamed of course, as to what he's done, but he wants everybody to know what he did, because then it shows just how amazing his transformation is later. That he can go from such one extreme to the next. So Paul's a great symbol of hope for change, in all honesty. Yeah, that you can go from right over here to right over there, quite frankly. Yeah. So that's our intro.
Like a lot of other people within the Bible, and within especially the New Testament, he wasn't a what you would call a good man, was he? He wasn't
not to start with, no.
Call a pillar of society. He was a bit of a
well, I think the thing is, it's like, to some extent he was a pillar of a certain part of society, not whole society, because you can't broad brush entire countries and stuff and nations and people groups, can we? But he was certainly, to some people, he was like the exemplary one. Let's go back to what I said earlier, where he describes himself as that. He says, like, I was top of the game, basically. Yeah, was how he kind of was. Yeah, but he it's just quite a shocking way to be introduced, quite frankly. Yeah, and his change that comes in a little while, further in Acts, is made all the more amazing. But it didn't come straight away. So it's not like he just is. So we see him here at the stoning of Stephen, and then he disappears. He then carries on basically with what he's done. So he obviously gets some kind of special, I don't know, authority given to him to go and try and stamp out the early Christian church, and that's what he tried to do basically. So it goes on after that. That this is in that same part of the Bible, same in Acts, that basically on that day, the day that Stephen was killed, there arose a massive persecution against the church, and Saul kind of headed it up. So it says even here, Saul was ravaging the church, is what my Bible translation says. And he was going into house after house where he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. So he literally went around with a group of people who were authorized to do so, and they rounded up Christians for being Christians, which is kind of the same thing that sadly happens in many countries even to this day. People are rounded up just for being Christians, just for that reason, not for anything else, but just for believing in it, basically. And he locked him in jail. And again, it's only like 3 verses long there, 3 little sentences. But again, to put it in my imagination and to humanize it, these are mums, these are dads, these are sons, these are daughters, grandparents, old, young, doesn't really matter. He's destroying whole families, whole households, and sending them off to prison. And that's just grim, in all honesty, isn't it? It's really grim. Yeah.
It is. I was watching something with one of my kids not so long ago, and it was about, I think it was something like Horrible Histories or something like that.
Yeah.
It was talking about the Roman persecution of Christians.
Yeah.
Would Paul have been involved with the Romans? Is that who he was involved with? Or?
So more info about Paul. So Paul himself was a Roman citizen, which was quite, he used that when he becomes Paul the Apostle. He uses that to his advantage, because if you were the Roman Empire at this point is pretty big. Most of Europe is, and the Med and the Middle East is under their rule, basically. And if you were a Roman citizen, you had certain rights that other people didn't have. And Paul used them to his advantage when he was preaching Christianity and preaching Jesus to people, because it meant he was protected from certain arrests, and he was protected from certain punishments and all that kind of stuff, because the Romans, they didn't look after their own people in the way that a modern nation does, but they still did something for their own citizens that they didn't do for subjects, for want of a better word. So he at this point, the Romans haven't properly started persecuting the Christians, because at first the Romans don't really, they're both bothered and not bothered about it at the same time. I think most of them just kind of looked on it as like it's just a disagreement within, Israel, within the Jewish faith. As long as it doesn't bubble up into any civic trouble, then we're not that interested. All they really care about is as long as the tax money keeps coming. The Romans weren't too fussed what you believed, as long as you kept the gold flowing to them, basically. But when we get on to later on in his life, then Paul actually starts to experience Roman persecution. But at this stage, like right at the beginning, the Romans were still a bit, it was a small scale little thing in a small little part of their empire. So they were a bit more like, not interested in that just yet. But it comes later. So this is a persecution of like the authority figures. Basically not the Romans. The next level under them. The same people who had Jesus put to death that we talked about in our last podcast episode, basically. He's like working with them, basically.
So the Jewish elders,
like the Pharisees and things like that. So they were people who got quite a lot of stick from Jesus himself when Jesus walked, on the earth, because of how they treated the people. The common people of Israel. They were very, they kind of lorded it over them. They looked down on the people. They made themselves out to be much better than the people. There was a lot of, Jesus identifies so many problems with them, basically. And Paul's basically one of them, really. That's where he comes from. And so he, with that authority, he goes about and he does his best to destroy Christianity before it can kick off, basically. Because he obviously views it as a complete, he viewed it at this time as a complete pack of lies, and it was his job, as he saw it, to go out and destroy it, basically. Yeah, and so he did his best. Yeah, he did his best. Luckily, he didn't succeed, but he tried at first.
No.
Yeah.
So did he? Was he just a sort of provocateur, or did he get hands on and did he actually sort of kill anybody
Yeah,
himself?
I don't know. In all honesty, I don't think it ever is. He ever gives us that much of the detail. He certainly had a reputation, and everybody knew him. But whether or not he did his dirty work himself, or whether or not at this point there were actually any other than Stephen, as I say, it says that they were like chucking him into jail. So I guess they were hoping like bung him in jail for a few weeks, and they'll hopefully, give up this belief and stop. Yeah. But he certainly was well known, which is where we get on to when he experiences his conversion. Yeah. Later on. So yeah, I don't know if you want to move on to how he becomes the man we know, because this is where it becomes so fascinating. Just remember who he is right now. He's Saul the persecutor. He's Saul the, I will put you and your whole family in jail. You will lose all of your property, all of your finances. You will have nothing. He's that. At the moment, he's that character. And then he changes. Yeah, and that's where it gets really fascinating. Yeah.
So take me through this journey from this persecutor
to
the man that we know today as Paul.
Yeah. So it all happens quite quickly in the book. Like you might have noticed, I haven't had to turn the page on my Bible just yet, because it's all in the same kind of couple of pages. So yeah, he goes out on his persecution journey, and he's on his way to Damascus, which is still, obviously, city Damascus still exists today, doesn't it? So he's on the road to the city of Damascus, where he's going basically with road to Damascus. Yeah, he's going with a couple of, I don't know if you call them friends or just acquaintances, colleagues, I don't know what word you'd use, but he's going with them to basically look for further Christians. So he's expanding where he's going, because obviously Christianity spread like wildfire. It just exploded. So a couple of chapters earlier in Acts, just to give everybody an idea of the scale of it, Peter, the other really famous apostle that most people have heard of, the other early follower of Jesus, he preaches his first message only a couple of weeks really after Jesus has been raised from the dead. And it says that, is it 2,000 in the first day are converted? And if you then just think of that spreading, those 2,000 are telling more and more people, and this message is just taking off basically. So that's why Paul is on his way to Damascus. He's following the trail of where he thinks Christians will be basically. And I'm reading it now. So as he went on his way, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed all around him. So remember, this is Luke writing, but obviously Paul would have been the one who, later on when they wrote this book, about probably 30 years later or something, this is Paul who's going to be telling Luke, and this is what happened to me next. This is what happened to me next. So yeah, a light from heaven flashed around him, and falling to the ground, so this is Saul, he heard a voice saying to him, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" So that's the beginning of it. So he's on his way to Damascus to put more Christians in jail, and suddenly he's flung to the ground by a light, basically. And out of this, experience, out of this light almost, he hears that voice. Yeah, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And everybody can probably guess who that voice belongs to. Jesus, yeah, basically, yeah.
The resurrected Jesus.
The resurrected Jesus, now in heaven, basically, yeah. And as you can imagine, this is quite a shock to Saul, to put it kind of mildly. And Saul says back to the voice, I don't know if "says" is the right word, cries out. It's probably quite a frightening experience, I'm not going to lie. He says, "Who are you, Lord?" And the voice says, "I am Jesus, who you are persecuting." but go enter the city and you'll be told what you are to do. So that's kind of the start of it, really. So Saul cries out, basically saying, "Who on earth are you?" He knows that this is something otherworldly because he uses that word Lord. Who are you, Lord? He knows that this is, Paul believed, of course, it goes without saying, Paul believed in God, and Paul believed in angelic beings and all that kind of stuff. So he's aware that he's encountering something and someone here that is beyond him, basically. Yeah, not just another man. Yeah. And he then finds out that it's Jesus who you are persecuting. And I know our podcast is about Paul in that sense, but I can't get over that Jesus identifies himself with those people who have been persecuted earlier in the book. I am Jesus who you are persecuting. It's like, well, no, you're in heaven, Jesus. I haven't done anything against you, but Jesus identifies himself with everyone who believes in him down on earth. So he views it as, you're persecuting me. Like he identifies himself so closely with people here. They are that close to him that to love them is to love Jesus, and to hate them and persecute them is to persecute Jesus. That's how he sees it, basically. Yeah.
I can identify with that on a deep level. I mean, my story, and everybody, pretty much everybody knows my story now.
Yeah.
But having met Jesus,
and
in such a profound way, and having spoken to him, it doesn't surprise me that, because the way that he speaks can be quite cryptic, and the way that you read it in the Bible is quite cryptic. But to go from someone that hated God, and then having a meeting, and then accepting, that was kind of my sort of road to Damascus moment. I can feel that on a deep level. And I think that's for pretty much everybody, no matter what their story is, no matter how gentle or how hard it's been, to meet Jesus for the first time is,
don't you?
Indescribable.
Yeah, I had the similar sort of thing. My road to Damascus, and that is a phrase, isn't it? That's he had a road to Damascus moment. Yeah, mine was similar. I couldn't call myself a Christian. I was like a cultural Christian. Like quite a lot of people still in the UK are like culturally a Christian, but not actually a believer, so to speak. Like it's you might go along to the odd Christingle service, if that. And, you'd say as a Christian country, I've got Christian values. I was that kind of, I'm not belittling that. I'm not mocking that. I'm just saying that's where I kind of came from, basically. Yeah. And I had my moment, where I was about 19 or something like that. And I randomly picked up a Bible. And to this day, I couldn't tell you why on earth I picked up that Bible. I just picked it up. A lot of houses still have a copy. If not, anyone can get it on their phone, can't they? But I picked up a paper copy in my house, started to read it, and I was a Christian that day. And it was like, I knew, like, I've met this man now. Like, I've met him. And I remember I spent the next week, because I was by myself for that week, I did nothing but read that book and go outside. And I remember spending a lot of my time looking up. I'm not saying necessarily the old school, like, heaven's up here type thing, but I just couldn't get over the fact that I was like, you're there. You've always been there. And I didn't know, I didn't know this whole time. Yeah. And I think that's, Paul in a much more dramatic way than that one that's what he's now experiencing, basically. Yeah. But I think Paul's is probably a bit more scary at first, because it's probably quite scary to find out not only does Jesus exist, when you didn't know he was real and you've treated him with a bit of disdain, but you've actively been throwing his followers into prison. It's probably quite a shock, isn't it, when you find out? Yeah. But Jesus tells him, carry on. Yeah, as in carry on your trip. Go to Damascus. Yeah. Not carry on persecuting, but carry on going where you're going. Yeah.
That must
Yeah.
have been bizarre.
Yeah. Yeah.
That must have been bizarre because you know why you were going,
Yeah. But now you're
and
not.
now
Yeah.
it's all changed. Now you're not, and
Yeah.
walking into the unknown. That must be
Yeah.
just.
Yeah. 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 So it says that when when the light stopped shining around him, so his followers were with him. It says the men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice but seeing no one. So they could hear this presumably thundering voice, but they couldn't see anyone like Paul could, basically. Yeah. And it says that he rose from the ground, and although his eyes were opened, he saw nothing. So they led him by the hand and brought him. And for 3 days he was without sight, and he didn't eat or drink. So basically, he's blind when he wakes up from this. I don't think wakes up's the right word. When he gets up physically off the ground after being thrown off his horse, he's blind, basically. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And yeah, he doesn't eat or drink for 3 days. And I think this is where he has a lot of rest. He must do, this is kind of me speculating a little bit, but he must have to do a lot of wrestling and a lot of, that must have been quite the 3 days. Yeah. Yeah. Because he suddenly found out everything he thought was wrong. Everything that is true, he spent the last however many weeks or months trying to destroy. He's now met the Lord, but it must also have been quite amazing in the sense that the Lord told him, not, Saul, I'm the one you've been persecuting, and you're now ruined forever. Away with you. This Jesus has now told him, like, giving him a mission almost. So I don't know. It must have been quite the 3 days. That's all I'm going to say. Yeah. Yeah. And it also shows, I'd say again, the absolute mercy of Jesus, that he appears to this chief persecutor of his church, his people, his friends, and he doesn't destroy him. He rescues him, basically. Yeah. Yeah. He rescues him and sends him on a mission. Yeah. Yeah. So it's quite amazing stuff. Yeah.
So, who's he going to see then? He's been given a mission and he's been told to go to Damascus.
Yeah.
Who's he going to see? What's the purpose of that?
Yeah. So at this point, Paul doesn't know. His original mission to Damascus is now gone, because there's no way he's going to Damascus now to round up Christians. He now realizes that these are the people who have it right, So it's actually Jesus himself who then sorts out where Paul's going. So it says that after this happens, or just after, whenever, there's a Christian in Damascus called Ananias, and basically Ananias himself has a vision of Jesus, and Jesus appears to him and basically says, Ananias, there's a man coming to this city now called Paul, and I'm looking at it here, and it says, you're to look for this man called Paul, for behold, right now he's praying. So Jesus is talking to Ananias, but knows that at that very moment in time, Paul is praying, because he can hear Paul's prayers. So that gives us a window into what Saul was doing in those 3 days. He's praying, basically. Yeah. And Jesus says he's seen a vision that a man called Ananias is going to come in and lay his hands on him, and he's going to regain his sight. So Jesus sets up the place for Paul to go, basically. So yeah, Paul just goes to Damascus because because God has told him to, but he doesn't know what on earth he's going to do when he gets there. But Jesus has already prepared that for him, basically, by appearing to one of his other followers called Ananias and telling him. Yeah. And Ananias has got a great answer, which is Ananias says, Lord, I've heard about this man and how much evil he's done to your people, and that he's got authority from the chief priests to, basically imprison and tie up everyone who calls on your name. But Jesus says to him, go, because he is my chosen instrument to carry, the message about me to everyone, basically. Yeah. So that's what I was saying earlier about when you asked him how much of the dirty work did Paul get involved in. We don't quite know, but he had a reputation that this bloke who lives in Damascus, which is far, but not exactly close, he knows who Paul is, like the Christians knew who this man was. And yeah, Ananias is a little bit confused at first, saying, you want me to go and meet the man who chucks us into jail? Yeah, that's a test of faith, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah. And
it
Jesus
is.
basically
You
says,
can imagine that.
yeah,
It's like, you what?
yeah, yeah. Are you sure? Yeah, that's basically what Ananias says. I've heard about this man. Yeah. And then, but Jesus says no. And then Ananias does as he's told, basically. And this is where, yeah, it's a bit of a process. It's a road to Damascus like moment, but it's also, this takes place over a few days, of Paul coming out of who he was and coming into who he becomes, basically. And again, on people's journeys to become Christians, on people's journeys for change, I guess it can be really quick. It can be a bit longer. Even Paul has several days before he comes out the other side. And several days sometimes sounds like a dream, doesn't it? I'd love to change in several days, but I think it's there as a picture for us that some things happen instantly, some things take a bit of time. Yeah. And so Ananias goes and he finds Paul, basically, who, I don't think it would be that hard to find Paul, because if Ananias knows who Paul is, I'm pretty sure everybody else knew who Paul was. He's got the reputation. And Ananias finds him, basically, and calls him for this. I love this. First words that Ananias says to Saul are, "Brother Saul." Again, isn't that amazing? And this is so much easier said than done, isn't it? But like, that's what Jesus can do, which is that you can immediately love someone who you have every reason to hate. Ananias probably had a lot of friends who were in prison because of this man. He probably knew people who had gone to jail. Ananias has a reason to not like who this man is, but the first thing he says to him is brother, not just like friend, brother Saul. And he says to him, the Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on that road, has sent me to you so that you might regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit. And that's a very Christian phrase, be filled with the Holy Spirit. So the Holy Spirit is himself God. It says one God and then three persons, the Father, the Son, which is Jesus, and then the Holy Spirit. One God, three persons. If you try and wrap your head around that, it's very difficult to logically work through that, because you're dealing with something that wasn't made up by people. It's people having to deal with a real being that is far beyond their comprehension, basically. Yeah. If I was making up a god, I wouldn't make up a god like that. Yeah. There's a side note, tangent. So to be filled with the Holy Spirit is like is Bible speak for basically, God himself will live within you. He'll be your friend, your guide, your counselor. He will be all these things to you, basically. Yeah. And that's what happens to Paul. It's because it says that. And immediately something like scales fell from his eyes and he regained his sight. Then he rose and he was baptized. And then he eats some food and was strengthened. I love that little detail at the end. He's not eating for 3 days, so he has a snack as well. Yeah. But that's
baptized.
Yeah, he's baptized as well. So there and then, Stephen baptizes him. Yeah. And that thing there, that phrase, immediately something like scales fell from his eyes. It's like he was blind, basically, both literally, but also like spiritually. And now he can see properly again. Yeah. And so we've now gone from Paul/Saul, the persecutor, to Paul/Saul, the apostle, which is that, again, Christian word. It's an old Greek word. It basically means like someone who's been sent, like messenger, basically. So he now becomes Paul the messenger, really. Yeah. So quite an amazing change in the space of a few days.
Yeah. So, I mean, it was quick then. It was quick. It wasn't sort of over months or years. It was just over days, and he was kind of thrown into the fire, was he not?
Yeah, big time. Oh yeah, big time. Yeah. So he's out of everything he knows, basically. Again, if you put yourself back in the time period and you put yourself in his shoes, everything he had, this status of being such a special, like, student amongst all of his peer group, and as being this really influential member of the high up parts of society. He's now lost all of that completely, because he has now become the thing that the authorities are trying to destroy. He's now one of them, basically. Yeah, so it's quite quite a change for Paul. And he does get thrown in the deep end, or into the fire, like you say. So it says basically after he gets his conversion, he regains his sight. It says immediately he goes to the synagogues, so to the church building equivalents, and he starts telling everyone about Jesus. So this is like a couple of days later. It says for some days he's with them at Damascus. So he's just getting over what's happened to him and learning and talking to these new people who call him brother, who he calls brother and sister. And then straight away he's off. Like, I need to tell everyone about this man. Yeah. And so that's what he does. And everybody, it says, is amazed because all of them are going, aren't you Paul? Like, aren't you here to arrest all these people? And now you're actually joining in with them and preaching their message, basically. And he uses all his skills. It says that he increased in strength and he confounded them who lived in Damascus by proving Jesus was who he said he was. Because obviously he's very clever bloke. He was right above all his peer group. He's very smart. So he uses all his gifts and his talents to, make his point. And basically it says that they then plotted to kill him. So he himself now is at risk of death only a couple of days after he's been changed and converted. Yeah, because he's now a bit of a poster boy for the Christians, isn't he? And so he's now a big threat. Yeah, because you can't have someone going around, saying who's been on your side now saying, I was completely wrong and this is the way and I'm proof that anyone can come. Yeah, that was seen as a big danger. So they try and kill him basically, but they failed. Because I don't know how, it just says that he becomes aware of their plot. So somebody tips him off, basically, that, they're trying to kill you. And he makes his quiet, I don't know if escape's the right word, but his disciples basically smuggle him out of the city, his friends smuggle him out. Yeah. So, and then begins his journey, really. Yeah.
To go from the poster boy of persecution to the poster boy of Christianity against everything you used to. And I know that, deep in my heart, if somebody that persecuted me walked into church,
it's hard, isn't
it, and started preaching and talking, I would have some issues with it.
I think that's I know where you're coming from. Yeah, I think that must have been that'd be hard today. It would definitely be hard then. I think that's the thing though, like we were saying earlier, the capacity of Jesus to change people. He really can change people so that you can deal with or he will lead you through what you're dealing with as an individual, but he also enables you to move beyond what other people have done to you as well. I'm not saying that he trivializes it. We're not saying he ignores it. We're saying he helps you in that and can enable you to still live that life in him, which is a life of happiness and joy, and to live in that, to not live in, the lower end would be grudges, the upper end would be, festering in that sense of hate and all that. He delivers people out of that and lets them live joyfully. That's how I would put it. And so at this point, as I say, his disciples took him by night and led him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a basket. So they smuggle him out of the city in a basket, lowering him over the wall. But again, the point I was going to draw out of that is it says his disciples, so already, just after a few days, this community who he was trying to destroy, they love him. They genuinely love him. And not just a couple of them, but he's got a group who are determined, we're going to save you from this. We're going to get you out so you can keep preaching. So these people, as you just said, they had every right to be a bit, I do not want this man in my weekly church group. Like, no, no, no. But instead, they love him. You know, they don't just be like, oh, goody, they're coming to get him, serves him right. They're doing everything they can to save him, basically. Yeah. So Jesus really does change and can change people. Yeah. He can change and he does change people. Yeah. Yeah.
So tell me about some of his works that he did.
Yeah. So after this is where, Paul becomes, as I say, like, I think I said at the start, didn't I? Probably one of the most important or influential people in like history, because he's responsible for just so much in terms of like Christian churches being planted and people becoming Christians. Like he converts so many people, and he spends his entire life now, literally from this point on. Paul himself describes it. He says that for me to live is Christ, or for me to live is Jesus. It's like his own self. Like that's his words. You know, like his whole life, he says, is just like it's just Jesus now, and everything else. He actually says somewhere in here, and he says he counts it all as rubbish. Basically, he's like, you know, all the things I used to chase after and want, position, power, pride, all that, rubbish. You know, I don't care about that anymore. It's just Jesus or it's nothing. And yeah, so we know he was a young man when he was converted, because it says they laid their cloaks at the feet of a young man named Saul. We don't know what young man means. Does it mean late teen? Does it mean early to mid-20s, 30? We don't really know. But he then spends a good part of like 20 to 30 years now going about trying to convert the world, basically. Yeah.
Came here, didn't he?
Yeah, he came. He travels all over the Roman Empire, basically, because going back to what we said earlier about, because he's a Roman citizen, he has quite a few rights and he can travel more freely than other people could throughout the empire, because he's part of it. You know, he is one of their citizens, so he used that to his full advantage, basically. Yeah. So he got he went all through the Middle East. He went all through Turkey. He goes through most of the Mediterranean islands. He goes to Rome, into Italy. So yeah, he goes all over the place, basically. Yeah, he probably never made it. Not many people made it to England, basically, because that was. I can't even remember. I don't even think at this point England was part of the empire. They knew of it, but I don't think at this point. I think it's about 20 or 30 years later that the Romans finally occupy this part. I like to think that if it was part of it, that Paul would have made his way. Yeah.
Yeah.
Not because it's so special, but just based on who he is. If he had an opportunity to go somewhere, he was there. And he sets up this whole network. So like Luke, the guy who wrote this book, becomes a Christian probably through Paul. And then there's people like Mark and Timothy. So there's lots of big names in the rest of the Bible that you meet in Paul's letters. And, you know, he starts this, or like links in and builds up this big network of people to go out and preach. And he appoints himself. Well, actually, no, that's wrong. Scratch that. He doesn't appoint himself. He's appointed by Jesus to be, again, there's going to be a strange word here. He calls himself the sent one, the messenger to the Gentiles. And Gentiles is basically the biblical word that's used for anyone who wasn't Jewish, basically, you know, who wasn't ethnically part of Israel. So his mission basically was to go to those people. And it says that Peter's broad mission was to preach to the Jewish people. Yeah, like that's their, very, very broad. And of course, they would preach to anyone and everyone. But like the focus of their kind of individual like assignments or something that Jesus had given them was, Paul's was to go to people who weren't Jewish, didn't know anything of like Judaism and the whole like Bible history. He was sent to those people, basically. Yeah. They'd be pagans or atheists or any other. Yeah, those were the people that Paul went for. Yeah.
So can we just touch on, because you said Luke wrote the book. So just touch upon who Luke is. Yeah,
so Luke was, as I say, he was a very close companion of Paul, one of his really good friends. We know Luke was a doctor. because he calls himself that in his other book. Because obviously, as people might have already guessed, the four Gospels, the four like books that just give us the story of Jesus' life specifically, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's the same Luke, basically. So Luke, the book of Luke and the book of Acts are kind of like one big book, really. Yeah, we kind of almost unhelpfully split them up in how it's ordered in our Bibles, but in one sense they're a continuation. It's just like volume 1 and volume 2. Yeah, basically the extended edition, whatever word you want to use.
Yeah,
So
it's
Luke
kind of a
was
paradox as well, isn't it? His job in the writing, the way that the gospel is written, because it's quite methodical.
Luke was Luke says at the start of his book, he's like, lots of people have tried to write down everything about Jesus, and I've made sure that I wanted to write for you. He's writing to a bloke called Theophilus. He's like, I wanted to make sure I've investigated everything very carefully. I've spoken to the right people to make sure. So yeah, he was a very thorough, like historical minded kind of chap in that sense. Yeah. And he would have been again, to use that word, he would have been a Gentile. I don't think Luke came from Israel. I think he's a convert into the new faith. Yeah. So yeah, Mr. Luke. Yeah.
So we're moving into his sort of death now, are we?
Almost, aren't we? Yeah. It seems a shame to pass over so much of his life because he writes amazing books. So, as I say, a good, probably more than half the New Testament, so the part of the Bible that was written after Jesus, is written by Paul. So we've got loads of his letters still. Some are massive, some are tiny. The big famous one is Romans, his letter to the church.
My favourite book.
Yeah, there you go. Awesome book. So that was his letter to the church that met in Rome, basically, which was quite a big one. Yeah, right at the heart of the empire, basically. Yeah, and that's where Paul lays out so many like crucial teachings that Christians need to know, really. And he spent a lot of his time as well defending these teachings, because that's also what Paul did. It wasn't all like plain sailing. Like his life was really hard. Like one of the things Jesus says to Ananias that I didn't read earlier is Jesus says to Ananias, I will show him how much he will suffer for my name. So like Jesus knew and basically said that this was what Paul's life was going to be like. He was going to lead quite a suffering life. So yeah, I don't want anyone to go away thinking that it was like he got converted and then it was all like skipping through flower fields of happy. Like it was he had a really tough life. Yeah. So his missionary journeys were hard and really difficult. Even though he's a Roman citizen, it's still quite a formidable thing to do, to sort of walk across the Roman Empire. Travel was really dangerous. He got shipwrecked about 3 times? So he nearly dies at sea 3 times, and he's washed ashore and floats around the Med. Quite literally, is bobbing in the Med at various times, wondering if he's like, is this it now? When is it coming? Everybody, well, not everybody, a huge amount of people hate him and do their best to kill him. He escapes many a time of people trying to kill him. Often when he goes to places, he goes to a big town called Ephesus, and he causes a big problem and almost starts a riot in preaching there. So he's got like whole towns are almost rioting when he turns up. What else happens to poor old Paul? And the other thing, as I say, he deals with, and that's the reason for a lot of his letters, he has to try and keep the church on the straight and narrow, because there were an awful lot of what Paul and Jesus would call false teachers. So people who kind of mess about with the message of Jesus, either through, some of them will be ignorance, they just don't quite understand. But yeah, a huge one is money. And that hasn't gone away today, sadly. There's still people who absolutely butcher the Bible to make it all about money, money, money. Give me your £10 or give me more than that. It's just donate to my ministry and everything will be good for you. All that kind of stuff. Yeah. Paul encounters all that.
Screen.
Yeah. Paul encounters all of that as well. Yeah. Paul encounters all of that and worse. Yeah. So he spends a lot of his time having to try and keep the church on track. And it's really hard for him because, again, put yourself in his shoes, his imagination. You've spent a year with some people, teaching them, building them up, creating a community that is, that loves one another, that cares for one another, looks after one another, seeks to do good to all those around it. And then you watch as people come into that community after you move on, because that's your job. You've established this place. You've now got to go look after your other church over here. And then you get a letter that comes to tell you from one of your friends, since you left, this group of people have now moved into the area and are now trying to wreck all of that and are destroying it by teaching this, that, or the other. So he goes through a lot of suffering and pain as well, because he feels a lot of responsibility for all these churches. He views them as his like spiritual kids, basically, that he's helped to raise, and he's now having to fight tooth and nail to keep them safe from swindlers and liars and cheats. So his life, we could go on, is really tough. Yeah, it's a really tough life. Yeah.
One thing I've noticed about the book of Romans is it's got a lot of meaty bits in there, but
yeah.
I guess one of the reasons I identify with it, my favourite verse is Romans 12:20.
Mm-hmm.
If your enemy hungers, feed him.
Yeah.
If he thirsts, give him the best wine.
Yeah.
The Lord will rain down hot coals
upon his head. Yeah.
And that's talking a lot about vengeance. I was at a place in my life where I had an arch nemesis. It's not healthy to have arch nemesis. I can tell you that. I was in a business that focused on vengeance.
Yeah.
But personally as well, it's so easy to someone does you wrong, you want to go out and
of course you do, don't you? Yeah.
And to forgive is
it's tough,
difficult,
to
say the least.
Yeah, it's really difficult.
Well, it's not for them, is it? It's not for them, it's for us.
Yeah. Basically, yeah. So you don't carry that weight of unforgiveness in that sense, and it's a difficult topic. We have to be like sensitive with it as well. Like forgiving someone doesn't necessarily, if it's something that needs police intervention, then the police intervene still. That is not, forgiveness doesn't mean, roll over and do nothing about, injustice and evil. It doesn't mean that at all. That's still something that has to, and rightly does, need to sometimes, What I'm saying is that it's that personal weight of like bitterness in you is the bit that Jesus wants to free you from. Yeah, that's the part he wants to take away. The bit that eats away at you. He'll get rid of that. Yeah, and that's what Paul has to. Yeah, Paul to some extent, he often says it when he talks about it. He has to do that almost to himself sometimes. Like Paul does remember his past. Like life, so to speak, where he was trying to destroy the church. Like he often brings it up in his letters. Like he calls himself the chief of sinners. So like basically the worst. And sinners, that Bible word for, someone who has done wrong against God. Paul counts himself as like the worst of them. He says that I'm the worst of all of that. He has to deal with that throughout his life, and remember. He does remember, like, this is what I used to do. He calls himself the least of all the apostles. So out of all those like select kind of people, again, apostle, I keep using that word, as I say, it means like sent one. They were like they were a group of people who had, like, basically you had to have seen Jesus himself, and Jesus would give you that mission of, you're going to be a leader in this movement, like above and beyond what's normal for people. And Paul himself, being an apostle, they often used to operate in quite a lot of miraculous gifts as well. So Paul says that in his letters, that's one of the signs of him being an apostle, is some of this sort of stuff. But yeah, he had to deal with remembering his past life, but he knew that Jesus had forgiven him that. Yeah, he knew that, there's no question in his mind, not because he deserved the forgiveness, but he knew that Jesus was so faithful and so kind and so merciful that if Jesus says, I forgive you, He doesn't lie. There's no lie there. It's I'm forgiven. I'm his. Yeah. Yeah.
That's a tough one for people to um, digest, I guess,
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah.
that you're forgiven.
Yeah. Yeah,
I couldn't forgive myself, but Christ
Yeah.
forgave me.
Yeah, it's really difficult, isn't it? And I guess I'm going to guess for some people it's quite easy, but for others it will be really hard because it depends on our own individual life, doesn't it? I can think of things that I'm really ashamed of, and that I've gone to God and I've confessed. Basically, I've said I'm so sorry. I hate that. Like if I could go back in time, would never have done X. And I'm sure loads of people have got a similar sort of thing. Where you just think, I wish I'd never said that, and that could be quite a trivial thing. It could be something absolutely massive. Yeah, and it's hard, isn't it? So it's not so much. I guess in the Bible, it's not so much about forgiving yourself. It's like resting in knowing that Jesus has forgiven you when you've come to him. It's that. And that leads you then to feel that weight kind of like fall off you, like putting a heavy backpack off, at the end of a walk. It's that kind of like, I'm going to leave this now, this guilt. It doesn't mean I can be all blasé about what I did. It doesn't mean I'm going to forget it. Paul never forgot. It just means, like Jesus has forgiven it. And if Jesus can forgive it, then I'm gonna rest in that, basically. Yeah, I'm gonna rest in that, not in myself, basically. Yeah. Christianity is a religion that kind of points you out of yourself. It deals with you as an individual enormously, but it does that by saying, look at him. There's a good quote that I like that I've used in my Christian life a lot, which says, for every look at yourself, take 10 looks at Jesus. It's like you have got stuff in you to deal with. There will be stuff about ourselves that we think, I can't overcome this. I need to overcome this. Help me, help me, help me. It's that kind of thing. But for every time you do that, look at him instead. Because he's the one who says, you might not be able to deal with that. I can. Yeah, I can. I'm God. I can do this. And it's not just I can, it's also that I will if you come to me. And it's also, I want you to come to me. It's all three at once. I can, I will, and I want is like that kind of thing. So for every time we look at ourselves, look 10 times more at him. Yeah. And that's what Paul does. That's Paul's life, basically. Yeah.
I do look at that a lot. I speak about it a lot. I speak about surrender a lot and acceptance a lot, especially within the recovery circuit. And the whole thing about, I think, as a new Christian, what was difficult for me was I couldn't understand the beauty of grace, that this free gift, and people saying, Jesus gave his life for you, as a free gift, and I'm like, yeah, but there's got to be some sort of cost.
Yeah,
because I'd been to churches before, and then there's some of the churches were these false teachers who were on about money and wanting money, and I don't want to go too far into that, but
no, I know what you mean.
To think about grace it's a scandal, isn't it? It's like
there's a book called like God's. I'm thinking of God's lavish. I'm sure there's one called Scandalous Grace as well.
Grace.
There's something along those lines, isn't it? Yeah, because it is really tough. Like, because you said it. You said there's not, like this. The idea of grace, it basically means like God's treating you how you don't deserve. It's kind of like is one definition, isn't it? And you said that there's no cost to it. Like we don't have to earn that. We don't earn his good favor, and that is 100% true. But there was in one sense, like Jesus didn't buy God's love for us, because the Bible says very clearly, God so loved the world that he gave Jesus. So the love came first. Jesus doesn't have to sort of try and make God love us, God the Father love us. The love was already there in the sending of Jesus. And then all the work that was needed to secure our forgiveness, which is what the cross does, that's all done by Jesus, which means, as you say, that for you and me, there is no work to do. I don't have to buy this forgiveness. I don't have to earn this forgiveness. Yeah, like I never will. You know, like I can't ever earn forgiveness for things I've done.
No.
Yeah, so it's just not going to happen. But Jesus says, yeah, you don't need to earn it. I've done that for you. You know, I've got your forgiveness, and the love was already there. You know, it was love that sent me to win you, basically. Yeah. Yeah, and that's the message that was true for Paul, and it's true for you, it's true for me, and it's true for anyone. Yeah. Yeah.
God took Paul, who, so he, in a nutshell, he was relatively young and changed him in such a profound way over days and then over the next few decades. So I presume he would have still have been, compared to now, relatively young when he died.
It's hard to pin down because they don't tell us anyone's age. The biblical authors, I guess, maybe it wasn't so important to them as it is to us now. Our date of birth is quite linked to like our whole lifestyle, isn't it now? But I don't know how much it was for them. He was certainly old enough that, and quite frankly, his life of constantly, he was beaten loads of times as well. He had, you know, and all the stress of trying to deal with it. But basically, yeah, he was very frail by the end of his life in one sense. Yeah. So, and age must have played a part in that. You know, I'm going to guess he was in his 60s or something like that. That's my guess. Other people who know more than me can probably say, no, that's wrong. That's too old or that's too young. But yeah, he was frail by the end, and he had some form, we think, of physical like impairment. We don't know what it was because Paul doesn't tell us. He just says that yeah, he had like what he called his thorn in the flesh. It was like something that really caused him a lot of spiritual and physical problems. But again, he doesn't tell us. When I say he doesn't tell us, remember, all the people who knew Paul would have known what it was because he was there and with them. It's just that in the letters he wrote, his focus wasn't on describing his own physical or whatever problem. His focus is normally on Jesus, isn't it? But so we don't quite know. We just get hints throughout his letters that he had something that was tough as well. Yeah, and that's the situation he's in when he reaches the end of his life, basically. And yeah, Paul didn't. He didn't die of old age or illness. Paul was murdered, basically. Martyred would be the proper term for it. Yeah. So, what we think. So we know that not through the Bible itself. So at the end of Acts, the book that we've kind of focused a lot of our chat in this evening, Paul's still alive at the end of Acts, but he's basically waiting to be transferred to Rome. You know, and in some of his other letters, he talks about like, remember my chains, I think is one of the last sentences we have from him. So he was, by the end of his life, he was imprisoned. And the Romans, at this point, as you asked earlier about did the Romans have any interaction, eventually Paul fell foul of the Romans because, you know, various reasons. It caused, Christianity caused them problems in the sense that the Romans don't like anything new that can upset the empire. So they don't like that. So, and also by going around saying that Jesus is the King of Kings, that rubs the wrong way up against the Caesars, who will quite frankly turn around and tell anyone, I'm the King of Kings, I'm the Emperor, no one else. So they viewed it as a political, because it is kind of political as well. As a, you know, they didn't like the political side of the message, and therefore eventually Paul was imprisoned and taken to Rome. So at the end of Acts, he's still awaiting going to Rome. So that tells us when Acts was written, because obviously if Paul had have died before Acts was, you know, before Luke wrote Acts, he probably would have written it down. Yeah, so that's how we can date Acts as being quite an early letter. You know, it's probably one of the earliest letters. Yeah, it's quite an early book in that sense. But yeah, so we know from, I like to waffle, don't I? We know from lots of early Christian writings what happened to Paul, because obviously other Christians wrote letters. They're not Bible letters, you know, they're not letters of the Bible, but people, same as you and I send WhatsApps, people would write correspondence to each other. Yeah, and that's where we learn that Peter and Paul both met their end probably in the 60s. Like literally, yeah, it's weird, isn't it, saying the 60s? This was the literal 60s. Yeah,
Yes.
the literal 60s. And that was when Nero probably was the emperor. And a few people might have heard of Nero. He was a nasty piece of work. He's a real, he's one of the crazy emperors in that sense. Like, well, that's a wrong word to use, isn't it? He was, by that I mean he was one of the, how do I describe him? He was vindictive, he was cruel, he was self-centered, he was quite delusional. He was just really horrible, in all honesty. And we think that the best guess, and again it could be wrong, is that we know for pretty much all but certain that Nero caused the Great Fire of Rome, which was, as the name would imply, similar to the Great Fire of London. Rome had a massive fire, basically, that burned away a load of the city. We know that Nero probably had that fire started deliberately because, oddly enough, the parts of Rome that burnt down, he wanted for palaces. So oddly enough, after the fire, he had lots of palace complexes built where people used to live. Yeah. So, and he didn't do anything to get the fire put out. That's where the phrase "to play the fiddle while Rome burns" comes from, because apparently that was the opinion of Nero, that he just let it happen and didn't get anyone to intervene until the parts of Rome that he wanted had burnt to the ground, so as a fresh blank canvas. Yeah. But anyway, the reason I'll mention all this is after that had happened, Nero needed to find some scapegoats to blame the fire on, because Romans were cheesed off. And just because you're emperor doesn't mean you were untouchable. If you became unpopular enough, then you would probably get assassinated, and then somebody else would take your place who had the support of the crowd, basically. Yeah. So Nero needed some scapegoats, and Nero decided to use this, newfound religion of Christianity as his scapegoats, and that's what Nero did, basically. So he launched the first big state-sponsored persecution of Christians across the empire. And this is where you get all the semi-famous things that people know of like being fed to lions and being carted off to colosseums, or just executed on the spot, basically. Nero used to use Christians, and this is to show you the true horror of it. Nero used to light his palace gardens with Christians who had been basically dipped in a type of tarry wax, and he would use them as candles and take strolls through the gardens at night time with the Christians providing the light. So Nero he was horrid, quite frankly. And it's probably Nero was the emperor who had, if not him directly, at least one of his immediate, subordinates somewhere in that chain of command are the ones who had Peter and Paul killed, basically. Yeah. So Peter was crucified. The accounts say it was upside down on Peter's own request, because he didn't believe himself to be worthy to die the same way that Jesus did. So he requested to be upside down. Yeah, he said, "I'm not worthy to die the same death as my Lord did." And Paul, again, we don't really know. He was a Roman, so he wasn't allowed to be crucified by law. So he was probably, he would have been put to death some other way. But the sources are unanimous, basically, that Paul was crucified. Paul was executed. In that Roman persecution.
The Romans did have some pretty evil ways to sort of dispatch people.
Yeah, at that time they were they were grim. They were really grim. Yeah, and that was probably what happened to the Apostle Paul at the end. Yeah, but he lived an absolutely amazing life. Like, his whole life was, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Yeah. And this is the thing, even though we've talked about how difficult his life was, how hard it was, how much he suffered, etc., 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 he's probably one of the happiest people that you can read stuff by. And that's what's really, you can use the word strange if you want. It's not strange when you know how, but he's not miserable in his letters. Like, he's really happy. Like, because he's got that perspective of everything that happens to me, as grim as it is, it's nothing. And again, it's not to trivialize people's suffering at all, but Paul's vision for himself, his perception for himself was, soon I'm going to be with Jesus forever. And all of this, he will wipe away all my tears. And that's a verse in the Bible. God will wipe away all their tears. And so he comes across as so happy in all his letters, because he just, I don't think he ever got over the fact that he'd become a Christian. I don't think he ever got over the idea that not only is Jesus real, but that he chose me, even though I was trying to destroy everything about his, trying to destroy him, to basically, in all his, I don't think he ever got over that. So in all his letters, he's so happy. He talks about joy all the time. Every other page, if you read Paul, he talks about happiness and joy. And he's not got anything that traditionally would make you happy. He's not got possessions. He's not got money. He's not got status. He's not got power. He's got none of that. His only happiness is Jesus, but that's a much better happiness than anything else, because it's the only one that can't be taken away. Yeah,
I agree.
Yeah.
So, to reel it in, what does that mean for us?
Oh, what does it mean for us? Yeah, so for us now, firstly, anyone can be changed by Jesus. Anyone. Doesn't matter how bad you might feel. You might not feel bad at all, but you want to feel bad, but you don't. Jesus can deal with that as well. It doesn't matter where you are. Jesus can deal with it if he will save, to use the Christian word, if he will bring into his family, into the church, a man who tried to physically destroy it, then there's hope for literally anyone. I don't care what you've done. If you want Jesus, Jesus will gladly take you and have you as his forever and ever and ever. And that's what Paul would want, I think, his story to really inspire in people. And Paul used his story for that very purpose. He used to tell people, I'm the chief of sinners. I was this, I was that, but I got mercy. Me, he used himself as a poster boy for, how on earth am I here? And if I'm here, you can be as well. So that's the real application I think, for all of us, really, in light of Paul's story and life. And also that I think the other application of his life, as I say, was that one I made at the end, is that life can sometimes be really, really difficult, and it can feel like there's absolutely no light, and there's nowhere to turn, and there's no hope, and it's awful. And Paul went through that quite a lot, bobbing up and down in the middle of the Mediterranean, thinking that his life's work, probably while he's away, has been destroyed by false teachers coming in. And but there is always hope in Jesus, basically. As grim as it gets, as grim as life gets, there's always hope and happiness. Yeah. I want to get away from that perception of Christianity as a religion of sour, moody, need to be a bit grim. No, Jesus wants to make people joyful, not just joyful because of stuff, but joyful because of him. And he's the one thing that can't ever be taken away. Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that sort of really blew me away about our church, really, that, I guess I grew up as a cultural Christian, though I dipped my toes in many other religions. And church was always a solemn affair. I guess in my late teens, the sort of new charismatic movement was hitting the Anglican church, so it was getting a bit more
clappy.
It was it was still happy clappy. That's what they used to call it. It was still kind of thing. So I guess I always saw church like that, and some of the churches that I went to, they were like, people were crying and having these things with that I didn't understand. The beat that I now know being taken over by the Spirit. And then you've got men like Grantley Watkins, who is just a phenomenal man of God that it brings so much joy to so many people. It brings so much joy to me. I love the man like a father, and you know, just seeing him when he gets hit, but with the Holy Spirit and the laughter that resounds through the church. It's just wow. That is the sort of things that we need to be associating church with, and not these solemn affairs.
I think there's sometimes church will feel serious, but and it should to some extent, because you're dealing with really big realities. But that's one of the core things that Jesus wants for everyone, is like, and that marks out a really happy, or that marks a Christian is joy. You know, like joy. Being a joyful person. That's what Jesus can give people.
We sing about it all the time, don't we? Like, there's joy in the house of the Lord. Bring me joy. And
it's one of the,
I didn't realize it was a gift.
It's a fruit,
one of the spiritual gifts.
Love, joy, peace, patience. Love, joy, right there. So
Amen. So what can we do to, if you've listened to this and you want to take the next step? We want to give you the opportunity to be able to do that. So how can we do that?
How can we do that? So if you're listening or watching this, and I don't know where you're at, but if you're at that stage, then you know that Jesus knows. So I don't know what you're at, and Jack doesn't know where you're at, but Jesus knows where you're at right now. So take that as true straight off the bat as we go into this next little bit. Jesus knows exactly where you are, what you're up to, where you're at, and what you need as well. So I think if I go somewhere, I'm going to go, and I might have even gone here last time, because it's probably my favourite passage in all the Bible, the amount of underlines and things I have in mind on this bit here. So this is Jesus talking to people. He says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger, and whoever believes in me shall never thirst. So he's not necessarily talking about food there. He's talking about being satisfied, like really inside yourself. But I said to you that you have seen me and yet don't believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. I love that verse. That's my favorite verse in all the Bible. Whoever comes to me, I'll never cast out, never drive away. Picture yourself. I think I said this last time. Picture yourself as literally all you've got is a hand round Jesus' ankle saying, please don't send me away. Whoever comes, I will never cast away. So if that's you and you're listening to this, let's just do a bit of prayer. And I can tell you what you need to do, because it's what Paul said to do, which is just believe in Jesus. That means to trust him. If you want to change, if you want to become his, if you want to be like Paul and go from being one thing to the next, if you need Jesus' help, wherever you are at, you just trust him for it, because right now he's saying, come to me. That's in Matthew's gospel. Come to me, everybody who's weary and heavy laden. That's another way of saying, if you're absolutely burdened down with everything or anything, come to me. So Jesus is saying that to you right now. Come to me. And if you do come to him, never drive you away. So just come right now. You don't need to come with fancy words. You don't need to come by cleaning yourself up. You don't need to come by changing anything. You just bring all your mess and everything to Jesus. So shall we just do a bit of prayer? Let's end it on it. So if you're listening to that and you know you need him, then just come to him. You can use words similar to mine, but you can use your own if you want. But it's basically just, Jesus, I need you, and I want you, Lord, and I thank you that you say that I should come to you, that you want me to come to you, and that if I do come, you'll never drive me away, Lord. You'll welcome me in. So I trust you, Jesus. I trust that you'll you'll save me, Lord. Save me from something else. Save me from myself. You know what you need saving from, and so does Jesus, and he promises that he will. So just trust him. Just trust him. And if you have trusted in him, then you get into this Bible, you start reading John, maybe start reading Luke. You get reading and you know that he is for you and that he cares for you and that he loves you. And I guarantee that if you have trusted him and are trusting him at this moment, you will meet him. Amen.
Amen. Amen. To all those that are out there that want to say that prayer, whether you're a literal prisoner or a prisoner of your own circumstance, I know that it might feel dark, and I know that you might feel alone, and I know that you're tired. I understand that. But I also want you to know this. You're loved so much by me, by Joe, by God. Catch you next time.